My name is Landon Hayes. I'm 41 years old, and until last Thursday, I was the lead product designer at Summit Peak Outdoor Gear in Denver, Colorado. 7 years building the brand's reputation for rugged, reliable equipment erased in a 15-minute meeting. It was Elena Stone, our new creative director, who ended it. She sat behind her sleek glass desk, flanked by Heather from HR, the way you might corner an animal you didn't trust. "We need fresh perspectives for our next chapter," Elena explained, her voice smooth and rehearsed. "Someone who truly understands emerging market trends." Translation: someone who would nod and smile while she turned a serious outdoor brand into a glossy fashion label. I kept my face neutral even as she slid the termination papers across the desk with manicured fingers that had probably never touched climbing rope or camp gear in real life. "Your portfolio lacks the innovation we need to remain competitive," she added. I nodded once, no arguments, no outbursts. Because while Elena thought she was dismissing a problem, what she was really doing was setting something in motion she couldn't control. I packed my tablet, my sketchbooks, and the prototype samples I'd kept in my office. Heather offered me a tight smile as she escorted me out, already mentally erasing me from Summit Peak's history. They had no idea. For months I'd sensed this coming. Ever since Summit Peak shifted leadership, ever since the strategy meetings changed from field-tested performance to aesthetic rebranding. Real outdoor challenges were no longer the focus. Glossy lookbooks and curated Instagram aesthetics were. Meanwhile, my designs, packs that carried weight more efficiently, jackets that adapted across climates, tents that could withstand brutal alpine winds, were being shelved, deemed too technical or niche. I didn't waste those months sulking. I documented everything, archived my work, perfected designs they'd rejected. As I drove home that morning, Denver's mountains rose in the distance, steady and indifferent, unlike Summit Peak. The mountains didn't care about trends, they only cared about what worked, about what endured. A text buzzed through from Brian, one of the few remaining engineers I trusted. "Biggest mistake they've ever made, letting you go." Maybe not, time would tell. At home, I spread out my latest sketches across the kitchen table. 12 fully developed collections, modular gear, adaptable clothing systems, specialized equipment. Each concept refined, each solving real-world problems, not marketing gimmicks. Summit Peak hadn't wanted them, but I knew someone would. I wasn't just carrying a box, and I wasn't done building yet. I didn't start out designing gear for catalogs or marketing decks. I learned design at my grandfather's workbench in the small town of Leadville, Colorado, a place where winter could kill you if you didn't respect it. He crafted wooden sleds, snowshoes, and canoes, always with an obsession for function over flair. "Form follows purpose," he used to say. "You build something because people depend on it, not because it photographs well." That philosophy carried me through college, through the early freelance gigs, through the long nights sketching technical gear for real mountaineers, not for runway models. It's what led me to Summit Peak 7 years ago, when the company was still scrambling to find itself. Back then, Summit Peak was known more for its solid warranty policy than for truly reliable gear. Their equipment was heavy, clunky, and dated. They didn't innovate. They patched holes, they followed, never led. James Whitmore, our CEO at the time, brought me in to change that. "Make things that work first," James had said during our first meeting. "If they happen to look good, too great, but function comes first, always." It wasn't a slogan slapped on a mission statement, it was the foundation. I spent the next 3 years rebuilding Summit Peak's product line from the ground up, no compromises, no cutting corners. The Ridgewalker backpack line, my design, revolutionized load balance, distributing weight so evenly that it extended endurance times by hours. The TerraFlex tent system could withstand Category 2 wind speeds, repel 98% of horizontal rain, and be set up by a single person in under 5 minutes, features no one else in the mid-market segment could touch. The customer reviews spoke louder than any marketing pitch. Real people, not influencers, not models, sent photos from base camps, glacier crossings, dense jungle treks, holding Summit Peak gear and smiling through the worst weather imaginable. Sales doubled within 3 years. Not because we had the sleekest ads, but because when your tent saves your life during a sudden alpine storm, you remember the brand that built it. Then James retired, and everything changed. The board brought in Vivian Shaw from a consumer electronics background, a woman who talked more about expanding demographic reach than about topographic durability. Vivian hired Elena Stone, a fashion industry creative director with a perfect digital portfolio, but zero field experience. Within 6 months, the conversations changed. We stopped talking about seam reinforcement and tensile strength. We started talking about color palettes and Instagram engagements. Urban was the new target word. Summit Peak wasn't trying to reach mountaineers anymore. They were after lifestyle influencers and suburban day hikers who'd never spend a night above treeline. Designs that took years to perfect were suddenly two niche features that meant survival in real conditions were deemed cluttered. One by one, my projects were either shelved, stripped of purpose, or quietly reassigned. Meanwhile, fresh art school hires with sharp-looking renderings but no field dirt under their fingernails were praised as the future. There was a time I might have fought louder, stood taller, forced the issue. But my grandfather's voice stayed with me. You can't build a shelter for people who don't even know they're standing in the rain. Some battles aren't lost in a day. They're lost the moment you let the wrong people redefine the mission. Summit Peak had forgotten who it was building for. And soon enough, the mountain would remind them. By the time summer rolled around, I realized Summit Peak wasn't just drifting off course. They were deliberately cutting the anchor lines. 3 months before my termination, I submitted my latest concepts for the next generation of modular outdoor gear. Equipment designed for real endurance, adapting to weather shifts without sacrificing weight or reliability. Elena glanced over the designs, once lips pressed into a faint smile, and slid them aside. Too niche, she said, not aligned with our new brand vision. A week later at the quarterly executive meeting, I watched in stunned silence as Justin Reynolds, the fresh-faced designer Elena had fast-tracked from a luxury apparel firm, presented a collection strikingly similar to my rejected work. Different color palettes, flashier presentation, but the core functionality, the modular philosophy, even some of the structural innovations, they were mine. I sat through the presentation without speaking, jaw-tight, heart hammering a dull rhythm of anger and disbelief. No one else seemed to notice or care. Justin received a standing ovation. Elena beamed proudly from the side. Vivian clapped with enthusiasm, already talking about the marketing angles. I knew better than to make a scene. I took notes instead, quiet, detailed timestamp notes. Later that evening, I called Thomas Wilder, my old friend now, a senior materials specialist at Ridge Trail Outfitters, Summit Peak's largest competitor. You still tied to Summit Peak by any contracts? Thomas asked after I laid it all out. No non-compete. I said James always thought those were unethical. My employment agreement is clean. Thomas whistled low into the receiver. That's very interesting, he said. Maybe it's time you showed your real work to someone who'll actually value it. I hung up feeling more steady than I had in months. They could sideline my ideas. They could erase my name from presentations. But they couldn't erase the fact that I was the architect behind what they were now calling innovation. Over the next few weeks, I spent every evening refining my original concepts, sharpening technical details, preparing professional presentations this time, not for Elena's aesthetic committee, but for people who understood the mountain wasn't something you could Photoshop. I stored everything securely backed up to cloud drives, encrypted, time-stamped, watermarked. Meanwhile, at Summit Peak, the culture rotted further. Production teams complained quietly that Justin's designs looked good in renderings, but were impractical to manufacture. Materials didn't behave the way flashy concept art imagined. Load stress points failed under minimal testing. Behind closed doors, engineers were quietly patching designs, fixing unseen flaws, salvaging what they could without rocking the boat. The cracks were spreading, but on the surface, Elena paraded Justin's concepts at trade shows and fashion expos, basking in the attention. None of it felt real anymore. Summit Peak wasn't designing gear. They were selling illusions. I didn't belong there anymore. And deep down, I think they knew it too. They weren't just pushing me out because I was old school. They were pushing me out because I knew too much about what real innovation looked like. And because eventually someone would notice that the Emperor's new gear couldn't survive a real storm. The morning after I officially signed my termination papers, I sat at my kitchen table staring at the sketches that Summit Peak had dismissed. 12 full design collections, modular packs, adaptive outerwear, all-weather shelters, each one crafted with real-world endurance in mind. They weren't just ideas, they were blueprints for a future Summit Peak had abandoned. I spent that weekend refining the presentations, tuning every detail, documenting every functionality spec, manufacturing process and material recommendation. I wasn't preparing revenge, I was preparing resurrection. Sunday evening, I sent a simple email to Thomas. Subject project proposal. Attached were 6 designs, each annotated with field application notes, test conditions, and manufacturing solutions. No drama, no complaints, just the work. Monday morning, Thomas called. His voice was sharper than usual, laced with energy. "These are incredible, Landon," he said, "exactly what Ridge Trail's been missing. Real gear for real conditions, not showroom pieces." "Glad you think so," I replied, "because they're ready. Tested, proven, and production friendly." There was a pause, then a low chuckle. "Melissa Hargrove, our creative director, wants to meet you today if possible." By noon, I was driving across town, portfolio in the passenger seat, heart steady in my chest. Ridge Trail's headquarters wasn't sleek or sanitized like Summit Peak's new offices. It was practical. Alive whiteboards covered in scribbled notes, material samples pinned to every surface, prototypes stacked in corners waiting for testing. It felt like walking into a working mountain base camp, not a showroom. Melissa greeted me at the door, a tall, weathered woman in hiking boots and a flannel shirt sleeves rolled to her elbows. No stilettos, no designer labels. "Good start." We sat across a battered oak table, surrounded by prototypes and coffee mugs. She didn't ask about my termination, didn't dig for gossip. She opened my portfolio, scanned the first few pages, and set it down. "This is what we've been missing," she said simply. "Functionality first, intelligence built in, not painted on afterward." She tapped one sketch, the modular climate-adaptive jacket. "We've been chasing something like this for 2 seasons," she said. "Our last design firm gave us pretty pictures. Yours solves real problems." I waited, letting her words land without rushing to fill the silence. Melissa leaned back, studying me for a moment. "How soon can you start?" "I'm available immediately," I said. She smiled. "Good, because if we move fast, we can launch your first collection ahead of the fall cycle." Ahead of Summit Peak's much-hyped relaunch? It wasn't revenge, it was justice. We shook hands, no fancy contracts yet, just an agreement between 2 people who valued work that spoke for itself. That night, I moved my sketches and prototype notes into Ridge Trail's system, working side by side with their engineers. They didn't ask for renderings with perfect lighting. They asked how the materials would behave at 10,000 feet, how seams would hold after a week of sleet, how the packs would distribute weight when loaded for real expeditions. For the first time in a long time, I felt like a designer again. Not a brand decorator, not a trend chaser, a builder. Deso one, de Witteramasaworm. The mountain hadn't changed. And now finally, neither would I. The first shot came 3 days after I started at Ridge Trail. A certified letter arrived at my apartment. Thick envelope, heavy paper. The kind of thing meant to intimidate before you even read a word. Inside was a formal notice from Summit Peak's legal department. They were reviewing my previous employment for potential violations of confidentiality and intellectual property agreements. There were no direct accusations, just enough vague language to rattle anyone without a good lawyer. Fortunately, Ridge Trail's legal team had already briefed me for this exact scenario. I scanned the letter, snapped a few photos for my records, and forwarded it to Melissa. She replied within 10 minutes, "Sit tight, we've got this." That afternoon, Ridge Trail's counsel fired back a blistering response. They outlined with precise documentation the timeline of my work at Summit Peak, when each design had been submitted, when it had been officially rejected, and when those same concepts had appeared under new management's visionary initiatives. They attached internal timestamps from Summit Peak's own project management system. Copies I had archived before leaving, showing my original authorship, and the dates Elena had formally dismissed each project. If they want to drag this into court, Melissa's legal advisor told me bluntly they'll lose more than the case. They'll lose their reputation. Still, the pressure campaign continued. 2 days later, I got a call from Peter Morris, an old colleague still stuck at Summit Peak. "Just a heads up," he said quietly. "Elena's spinning a story that you sabotaged documentation before you left. She's trying to convince Vivian you deliberately withheld production specs to cripple the new lines." I laughed, more bitter than amused. My handover documentation was so thorough, it could have trained an army. I said just and ignored it because he didn't understand half of it. "I know," Peter said, "but they're desperate. Summit Peak's production team is behind schedule." The prototypes are failing, QA left and right. Materials are wrong. Weight specs are off, assembly times are double what they promised retailers. The cracks were widening, and they were trying to pin the blame anywhere but where it belonged. You're about to be a bigger problem for them than they ever expected, Peter said before hanging up. The next morning, another letter arrived, this time a formal request from Summit Peak asking me to participate in an exit review to clarify outstanding issues. Melissa's response was swift. Mr. Hayes is under no obligation to engage further. Any additional harassment will be treated as retaliatory action under Colorado labor law. Summit Peak went silent for a few days after that. But I knew it wasn't over. The real battle wasn't just about designs or credits. It was about public perception. Summit Peak was banking on keeping their Elevation Series launch on schedule, hoping no one would notice that. The crown jewels of their new line were built from the work of a designer they had discarded and tried to discredit. Meanwhile, Ridge Trail moved at full speed. We finalized the Summit Series prototypes. Field testing began immediately. Early reports came back better than we dared hope, performance metrics exceeding even my original expectations. And behind the scenes, the buzz was building. Retailers started whispering about Ridge Trail's surprise new collection. Gear reviewers hinted at a seismic shift coming in the fall product cycle. Summit Peak could send all the letters they wanted. They couldn't unbuild the storm that was coming. They'd bet everything on style over substance. I was about to remind them what happened when you forgot the mountain doesn't care how pretty you look. It only cares whether you survive. The Summit Series officially launched on a crisp August morning under a sky so clear it looked painted. The announcement hit Ridgeline's website at 8:00 a.m. sharp. Melissa sent a simple internal email to the entire company. It's live, thank you all. Now watch. I refreshed the landing page on my laptop and stared for a moment, heart pounding harder than I expected. There it was. The full Summit Series modular backpack, climate-adaptive outerwear dynamic shelter systems live and ready for order. My designs, my vision, my name printed clearly under each product description, designed by Landon Hayes. No one was hiding it. No one was watering it down. By noon, Ridgeline's website had crashed twice under the traffic surge. Retailers flooded our sales team with calls desperate to increase their order quantities after early samples had sparked quiet buzz. By 3:00 p.m., 2 of the flagship products were back-ordered until October. Outdoor forums exploded with speculation. Industry bloggers dissected every feature. Early reviewers who'd gotten hands-on access weeks ago dropped their embargoed posts within hours. A revolution in technical outdoor gear. Finally, innovation that respects the realities of the trail. Summit Series sets a new standard. One blogger called the Ridgewalker Modular Pack the single smartest piece of gear released this decade. Meanwhile, whispers started growing louder. Comparisons between the Summit Series and the leaked marketing previews of Summit Peak's Elevation Series started popping up online. Side-by-side photos appeared on Reddit threads, gear forums, even LinkedIn posts. Separated at birth. The designs were unmistakably related structure functionality. Even certain modular features, but while Ridgeline's products were live tested and shipping, Summit Peak's line was still coming soon. And industry insiders weren't stupid. They knew my name. They knew where I'd worked. They knew exactly whose designs had been resurrected under new branding at Summit Peak. Melissa called me into her office that afternoon, her laptop open to an article from Outside Magazine. The headline made my breath catch. Summit Series versus Elevation Series, innovation or imitation. The article didn't accuse Summit Peak of theft outright, but it didn't have to. It simply laid out the timeline. The public rejection of my designs, my departure, the launch of the Summit Series, and the upcoming but suspiciously similar Elevation Series from my former employer. It ended with a quiet, brutal sentence. In the end, the mountain always rewards authenticity. I leaned against the wall of Melissa's office, feeling an emotion I hadn't tasted in years. Not anger, not revenge. Vindication. The work had spoken for itself. Not through angry words or lawsuits. Through performance, through resilience, through survival. The things Summit Peak had forgotten when they chose image over substance. At 6:00 p.m., Thomas swung by my desk with a grin. "You broke the internet today, Hayes," he said. "Summit Peak's PR team is in full damage control mode." I smiled, but it wasn't smug. It was peaceful. They could spin their stories however they wanted. The mountain didn't care. The people who relied on gear in real conditions didn't care. They knew now who was building for them. And it wasn't the company obsessed with polished lookbooks and influencer endorsements. It was the team still covered in mud sweat and the stubborn conviction that when you design for survival, the rest will follow. The Summit Series was just the beginning. We were only getting started. It didn't take long for Summit Peak to start cracking under the pressure. 3 days after the Summit Series launch, trade news broke that Summit Peak was postponing their highly anticipated Elevation Series due to supply chain adjustments. Internally, everyone knew what that really meant: retreat. Their production team couldn't replicate the designs without running into flaw after flaw because they hadn't been built properly from the start. They were cobbling together mock-ups from half-understood ideas without the core knowledge of how or why the systems had been designed that way. Meanwhile, side-by-side comparisons continued flooding outdoor gear forums. Bloggers dissected every detail. Gear testers posted early performance data. It wasn't even close. The Summit Series wasn't just better, it was superior in every measurable way: weight, durability, adaptability. And my name was printed right there in every product release, every feature article, every awards shortlist. One afternoon, as I wrapped up a meeting with Melissa about the winter gear expansion, my phone buzzed with a number I didn't recognize. I almost let it go to voicemail. Then curiosity won out. Landon Hayes, I answered. A long pause, then a voice I hadn't heard in months. Landon, it's Vivian. Vivian Shaw, CEO of Summit Peak. The woman who had stood silently by while Elena gutted everything we'd built. I think we need to talk, she said carefully. There's been some misunderstandings. I let the silence stretch long enough to make her uncomfortable. What kind of misunderstandings? I asked finally. Elena may have acted outside company protocols in certain matters, she said, choosing her words like stepping around landmines. The board is reconsidering our direction moving forward. We'd be open to restoring certain professional relationships. I almost laughed. 7 months ago, I was disposable, outdated, an obstacle to progress. Now, with their brand reputation in shambles and their flagship collection a public embarrassment, they wanted to patch things up. I appreciate the offer, I said evenly, but I'm exactly where I need to be. Vivian hesitated. We'd be willing to discuss leadership opportunities, she added, voice, tight, senior creative roles, full autonomy over future collections. It might have been tempting years ago. Before I learned the hard way that some environments aren't worth saving, some battles aren't worth refighting. I'm not interested, I said simply. Good luck, Vivian. I ended the call before she could respond. As I set the phone down, a strange calm settled over me. Not triumph, not revenge, just closure, just situation. They hadn't understood what they had until it was gone. And by the time they realized it, it was too late. The mountain doesn't forgive those who build weak shelters. Neither would I. 6 months after the launch of the Summit Series, I stood on a rocky outcrop overlooking Boulder Canyon, the late spring wind snapping against my jacket. A jacket I had designed. The Ridgewalker modular system had become a runaway success, not just in sales, but in real-world adoption. Mountaineers, thru-hikers, rescue teams. The people who actually needed serious gear had embraced it fully. It wasn't about shiny ads or influencer campaigns. It was about trust. Trust in gear that performed when it mattered most. Trust in a philosophy that never wavered even when the corporate winds shifted. At Ridge Trail, I wasn't just designing equipment anymore. I was leading a team: engineers, fabric specialists, field testers, all of them committed to the same principle. Function first, form follows always. Melissa had given me full creative control over our upcoming winter collection. Instead of trend forecasts, we studied climate data. Instead of chasing colors, we chased solutions. The work was harder, slower, less glamorous, but infinitely more satisfying. And the market responded. Ridge Trail's revenue had doubled over 2 quarters. Retailers increased orders even before samples hit the shelves. Industry awards followed, not for most stylish, but for best technical innovation and field-tested reliability. Summit Peak, meanwhile, continued to spiral. After a public leadership shakeup, Vivian quietly stepped down. Elena resigned to pursue new opportunities, though word inside the industry was that no major outdoor brand would touch her. They tried to pivot back toward authenticity, but the damage was done. Consumers remembered who had stayed true. Out here, reputation mattered. It wasn't about glossy campaigns. It was about the tent that kept you alive through a midnight snowstorm. It was about the pack that didn't rip halfway through a canyon descent. It was about the jacket that kept the wind and rain out when no one was there to see how good you looked. The mountain didn't care how trendy you were. It cared whether you respected it. And in the end, so did the people who lived close enough to it to understand. I sat down on the boulder and pulled out a battered leather notebook, the same one I'd started at Summit Peak years ago. Inside were sketches, notes, crazy ideas I'd been told would never work. Now they were blueprints for the future. I smiled as I flipped through them, not because I had won some corporate war, not because I'd proven anyone wrong, but because I had proven something to myself. That integrity wasn't just an abstract ideal. It was a strategy, a way of building not just products but a life. One deliberate decision at a time. One real solution at a time. One honest connection at a time. Looking back, getting fired was the best thing that ever happened to me. It forced me to choose compromise for comfort or build something real, even if it meant risk. I chose the mountain. I chose the work. I chose the truth. And in the end, that made all the difference. As the sun dipped lower over the canyon walls, I zipped up my jacket, tucked the notebook away, and started down the trail. There were more problems to solve, more needs to meet, more real people to build for, because trends fade, hype dies, corporations crumble. But real work that respects real needs endures. Just like the mountains, just like the people who climb them,